together stakeholders from the public and private sector to discuss key European policy topics. Today's event, Can Europe Future-Proof AI, is hosted in collaboration with Adobe. This is a very topical debate. In April this year, the European Commission unveiled a proposal for a new Artificial Intelligence Act, or the so-called AI Act. And the draft act is the very first attempt to enact a horizontal regulation of artificial intelligence. The proposed legal framework focuses on the specific utilizations of AI systems and associated risks. The Commission proposes to enshrine in EU law a technology-neutral definition of AI systems. It aims to regulate the use of AI to safeguard fundamental rights and values of EU citizens, as well as ensuring transparency and accountability. It also proposes a unified policy across the single market to ensure the regulation does not hinder the innovation. Renew Europe Group was the first political group in the European Parliament to publish its vision for the use of AI already in 2020. And the focus of the Renew Europe is to work for legislation that will enable the development of a trustworthy, ethically responsible, and technically robust AI with utmost respect for fundamental rights and freedoms. We would like to see in Europe a trend-setting set of rules, just like we did with GDPR. Currently, the AI Act proposal is provisionally assigned to the Committee on Internal Market and Consumer Protection, and Ms. Benifei, an MP from Italy, was appointed as rapporteur in June 2021. The Council issued a progress report just this November. Without any further ado, let me welcome my colleague, Ms. Svenja Hahn from Renew Europe Group with her keynote speech. Svenja Hahn will also be a shadow rapporteur on the AI Act and has been focusing her work on AI as a member of the special IDA committee in the European Parliament. Svenja, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ondřej, and thank you very much to Alde Party and Adobe for organizing today's event. It is extremely timely because since yesterday we finally have a decision in the Parliament who will work on that file. It will be the Single Market Committee and the Civil Rights Committee, the Interior Committee, the Libe Committee working on this in a shared competence. I'm glad that we finally, over more than half a year, have a decision. I have not been hiding that I thought it's a bit of a disgrace that the Parliament took so long to come to a conclusion, and it shows that there are political fights in the Parliament instead of being pragmatic and looking at the focus. But we see political fights are very strong in the Parliament. I'm happy that we finally have a conclusion. It's going to be shared competence between Single Market and Libe Committee. You're going to have the Juridical Committee going to have some exclusive competence, and the Cult Committee for Culture and Education and the Industry Committee are going to have opinions. So it's going to be surely a long process with a shared competence, but I'm happy that we soon can finally start working on this because we have already the Commission proposal and we have already at least some leaks from the Council position, and soon we'll have the official document. I'm very happy to be with you today. As Ondřej said, I'm our coordinator, Renew coordinator in the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and I'm also the shadow rapporteur in the Single Market on the AI Act. And we see an increasing role of emerging technologies such as AI in our everyday lives, in our economy, in medicine, but also in warfare and surveillance, also control of citizens. We see different approaches throughout the whole world, and the EU wants to regulate AI in a proper way, kind of being a trendsetter here, being the first aiming at having a whole regulation of this. Why should we do that, you might ask? I think it's important for creating legal clarity, but also defining regulation of technology that is based on European values and fundamental rights. And in my opinion, these are very, very fundamental aspects. So when we look at this, what should the AI Act be and what is actually currently discussed, it is that the AI Act should be a regulatory framework that allows the EU to actually become one of the most world's innovative regions and a leading player in developing and also deploying artificial intelligence. Especially for startups and SMEs, they need a legal framework that allows them to grow and limits red tape by setting clear and easily understandable rules. And by no means an AI regulation should block innovation or lead to brain drain of experts and companies. So this is really something new, because normally politics tend to overregulate something that has come up in the last years. And in this case, we want to set a solid framework for something that comes up in years that we cannot even imagine the potential of today. So you see that in itself already is a challenge for policymakers. And especially if you want innovation friendliness, like our group Renew Europe, you need to regulate smartly. Also, especially if you want to safeguard our fundamental rights as citizens. So abuses of technology that violates people's rights, as we see them, especially in authoritarian countries, is something that I do not want to see in Europe happening. So we cannot ignore that there can also be threats from the technology for our fundamental rights. But also, I often hear very, very negative warnings or approaches to new technologies that kind of want to overregulate in what I consider an inappropriate way, because that would be very harmful for innovation in Europe. So if we want to boost innovation, protect fundamental rights, this is something we could both do in the AI Act. I'm very certain we can, if we regulate in the right way. So the European Parliament, in my opinion, clearly has to improve the draft, where the Commission's proposal has some uncertainties, some shortcomings, unnecessary burdens for businesses, and insufficient protection of fundamental rights. So you can already hear a bit from where I'm coming from. I'm gathering a lot of input right now, because as said, we couldn't start with the groundwork with the work on the text yet. So we did the groundwork listening to a lot of stakeholders, and we got a lot of feedback, especially on the Commission proposal. I think it's going in general in a right direction. It in most cases strikes a good balance, but I see there are some aspects that need amendments, and some aspects that are severe need for amendments. I think what is mostly worrisome for a citizens' rights group like our is the Article 5, which is about biometric recognition in public spaces. So I'm severely concerned about the exceptions for the use of real-time remote biometric identification systems, because biometric surveillance and biometric recognition software threatens fundamental rights. It has proven to be discriminatory. It has proven to be unreliable in many cases. And the prohibition the Commission proposes only applies to the purpose of law enforcement. Also, the exemption that is foreseen allows a broad interpretation by member states, and the role of private actors remains unclear. And what we've seen in the leaks from the Council statement, they want to go even further. They want to broaden the scope not only to law enforcement, but also to authorities that collaborate with them. And they want to also expand it for critical infrastructure. That might sound reasonable when we talk about nuclear power plants, but critical infrastructure, for example, are train stations or airports. So spots where many of us are circulating around every day. So we see there will be some battlegrounds along these lines, but also some maybe not so fundamental seeming issues, but that will be very relevant aspects if we, for example, take a look at the definition. I think it's ambitious to try a definition of artificial intelligence. For example, we're not having a definition of the internet in other files. So I think it's pretty bold to try to define artificial intelligence, because I personally think it's always going to be too broad or too narrow, but it is in there. So I think we'll have to try. So, for example, what is currently in there is software that generates outputs that is based on human-defined instructions. But to be perfectly honest, this is a good example because this catches almost every software that analyzes data, and in my interpretation could go even down to an Excel sheet. So also this would apply not only to high-risk systems, but all AI systems. So the definition that is in there needs to be amended, it needs to be more precise, but we should really be careful that we're not over-regulating there. And this is actually one of the spots where we could kill innovation by meaning good. And also looking at the high-risk classification, we see in the Commission proposal, which is in Article 6 and Annex 3, for those of us that want to look it up, there's too much room for interpretation. It's too broad and thereby also compromising use cases that are actually not high risk. And the definition of what actually is high risk must be further clarified. And also in the Parliament, we see different approaches. We see different groups advocating, for example, everything that has to do around education should be considered high risk because it could affect the life of especially young children significantly. I think this is a bit going too much. I think high risk, we should really focus on where we can take into account the probability of harm occurring and the severity of harm. I think this is going to be a much more helpful approach than focusing just on sectors. So these are, of course, a few priorities from my perspective. It was my great honor to share with you my thoughts for today's keynote speech, and I'm very much looking forward to today's event and the thoughts of our round here today.
Great. Thank you, Svenja. Thank you for your remarks. Thank you for the good news that the European Parliament has finally managed to dismantle all the hurdles on the way for further work in the respective committees, and thank you for sharing with us your views on the file. I think there's actually a lot of to do, and wish you all the success in working together with other representatives, political groups on this important piece of legislation. Before I turn to our distinguished panelists, I would like to remind the audience that you can raise your questions in the chat or comments, and we'll get back to them later on when we opened our Q&A session. Now I would like to invite our panelists to join and give us their introductory remarks. I'd like to start, and I would like to welcome Ms. Stephanie Valdez-Scott, who's a Senior Manager for Government Relations Europe from Adobe, to give us her opening remarks. Stephanie, please, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning to all of you, and thank you for organizing this very timely event. As MEP Hahn just pointed out, finally we have clarity in the European Parliament. I'm delighted to speak with you today on how Europe can future-proof its approach on AI and how we at Adobe are already dealing with AI internally, and also, of course, what our views are on the AI Act. So at Adobe, AI technology is integrated into many of our best loved products and powers really amazing things across technology we create. It's from streamlining image editing capabilities in products like Photoshop to empower creatives. It's about automating digital document workflows so that you can actually do now in seconds what used to take days, and also helping enterprise customers gain data-driven insights and target their marketing for better results. While our products do not fall in the high-risk category, according to the AI Act, we do recognize that industry as a whole has a responsibility to promote the responsible use of AI, and we welcome the global leadership which the EU is taking with the AI Act. Of course, the continued advancements of AI put a greater responsibility on us to address bias, test for potential misuse, and inform our community about how AI is used. Our role is to ensure this new technology lives up to its potential, and we take the ethical implications of it very seriously. We are guided by 3 core principles, which are responsibility, transparency, and accountability to enable the thoughtful deployment of AI in our products. So we welcome the EU's risk-based approach outlined in the AI Act and have supported this idea from the outset. We believe it's important to maintain this approach that the EU has outlined, and so that we can focus our regulatory efforts on high-risk AI without slowing down the pace of innovation around AI that poses little or no risks, similarly to what MEP Hahn has just said as well. So to future-proof the AI Act, it's crucial that the definition of AI be sufficiently flexible to accommodate technical progress while being precise enough to provide legal clarity. And I agree with MEP Hahn that this is not an easy task to do. The current definition may lead to a very broad application and could include software that is normally not considered AI. In our view, and especially for high-risk AI, any regulation on AI development should be process and transparency oriented and focus on testing the outcomes of AI systems before deployment and also applying safeguards against biased outcomes after deployment. Efforts to reduce bias in AI should, from our point of view, focus on preventing harmful outcomes rather than trying to avoid bias entirely, which might prove very difficult or impossible in some cases. While the high-risk categories outlined in the legislation address the right areas from our point of view, we do believe that some requirements could be unfeasible or inefficient. We very much welcome the idea of transparency obligations on deepfakes, and are already exploring internally how to support our users in disclosing when AI is used to create manipulated content. I'm very much looking forward to exploring these issues in more detail with all of you today, and thank you again for the invitation and your attention.
Thank you, Stephanie, for sharing with us your views coming from the private stakeholder. And following your intervention, I would like to also welcome another fellow colleague, MEP Ms. Karen Melchior from Renew Europe Group, who is a member of URI committee, also working in other relevant committees, such as the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence and the Committee for Internal Market and Consumer Protection. She is invested in the legal work concerning the digital technology and artificial intelligence, especially from the consumer protection point of view in the era of digitalization. So without any further delay, Karen, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Ondřej, and it's a pleasure to be in the same digital room as all of you, but also that this is the second time that I'm listening to the work done by Adobe. A colleague of Stephanie's was part of the hearing within the AIDA workshop earlier this week concerning biases. And for me, it's the takeaway from working on artificial intelligence and how to regulate it for the last year and a bit is that it's not really the technology that we need to regulate. Well, first of all, because we don't all agree what it is that we mean by artificial intelligence, and the definition is difficult, as Svenja pointed out, but that it is the use of the technology that we need to regulate, because we can use the technology itself would be a little bit like banning the use of a hammer or banning the use of a knife, because you can use the knife both to kill somebody and to spread butter. So we need to look at the uses of the technology and have some very clear regulation on how this is being used. One of the problems is that by identifying specific sectors as being high risk as a sector-wide level, this causes problems for the use of artificial intelligence that would make work easier without actually posing high risks to citizens, users, and consumers. So therefore, we need to look at the proposal from the Commission and make it more nuanced so that we don't say you're not allowed to use AI in educational or medical uses. For example, there is a Danish company that is using AI to identify fractures and problems with ligaments in X-rays in order to help identify problems earlier and sooner for the doctors. But there is not, it is not such a high risk use, but it is within a medical sector, and therefore it is being identified as high risk per definition. And there, I think it's really important that we look into how we nuance this and how we also make it more clear for the companies that want to use artificial intelligence in their products so that they know what they're allowed to use and what certification, what approval processes that they need to go through before they can put their products to the market. Because if we make the process for companies to develop AI systems burdensome and unpredictable within the European Union, we risk hindering business development and innovation in Europe without actually providing a better protection. Where I am concerned about the use of AI is where we have, for example, either companies disproportionately using it, for example, biometric recognition for presenting you advertisements on the street. I don't think there's a proportionate or relevant use of AI that I would get special female advertisement because the AI of the poster board thinks that I'm female and I should be presented with these adverts because it is not proportionate, and also that the technology will be flawed. It's difficult enough for us to distinguish race and gender as humans, but putting those difficulties into AI, we risk having a very problematic situation. On the use in law enforcement, I agree with Svenja that we really need to have better legal protections for its use. There is a recent study in Denmark looking at the use of police intelligence tools in the Danish police force. And there is a large number of police officers that have gone in and looked at the files and the profiles of citizens just because they were curious. And we need to make sure that if we use as powerful tools as biometric identification and artificial intelligence, that we have the proper guards against misuse by individuals within the authorities. And that's why we've been asking from the European Parliament for having the proper legal framework before we allow the use of artificial intelligence in law enforcement and other authorities. Finally, I think it's also important when we discuss bias that we not, as politicians, pretend like if we just have data enough, then we can eliminate bias. If we have the perfect data set, something like that, it's written in the proposal, then we will eliminate bias. We really need to look at the method for developing the AI. Part of that is the data that it's based on and trained on. It's also the diversity of the team, but we also need to look at, as Stephanie was saying, we need to evaluate the outcomes of the results of the AI, because you can have a perfect recipe for baking a cake, but it might end up tasting bad in the end after all. So you need to make sure that there is a just and fair result when using the AI. And even if you've checked that you made the most just and perfect recipe for producing the AI. Where I see a challenge is how we can discover flaws in the use of the AI if we don't know what we're looking for. There is a very old by now example of an AI that was supposed to distinguish between a wolf and a pet dog. So you presented a lot of images to the AI and it was able to distinguish between a wolf and a dog. The only problem was it wasn't actually distinguishing between the animals. It was distinguishing between whether or not there was snow in the background. And there you can actually discover it quite easily. But if you're using AI to try and see if you should, for example, help children of vulnerable families, possibly remove them from their families and take them into sheltered housing, then how do you know whether the AI was identifying the wolf or the snow in the background of the wolf? Because the multitude of factors that it's looking into when trying to help children, how can we as humans afterwards see whether it was actually checking for the shoe size of the children rather than relevant factors?
Thank you, Karen, for sharing with us your views and I think quite an interesting examples. the use of AI. We start receiving some questions from the audience, so I would like to remind and encourage all those who are listening to us and watching us this morning to not to hesitate to send us more questions, and we'll come back to them just in a bit. But maybe at the beginning, I would like to hear your views on one of the aspects that was mentioned, I think, by Stephanie in her remarks, which regards the issue of deepfakes. The AI Act is introducing transparency obligations for AI systems, including those on the users of AI systems that generate deepfakes. So, what, in your view, could this legislation or any other relevant legislation have when it comes to increasing the transparency online and then addressing the issue of deepfakes? If all of you can give us your views on this particular issue, which I think is quite interesting and intriguing also for our audience. So Svenja, would you start, please?
Surrender, my connection was really bad. I was hearing a lot of Blister. Could you just very quickly?
Absolutely. Basically, the question is what role the AI Act and or other relevant legislation can have when it comes to increasing transparency online, addressing the issue of deepfakes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the AI Act is actually the right instrument for that. I think this is actually maybe more of a DSA topic where we talk about responsibility of platforms. I think also maybe there's a possibility to include in general deepfakes in the AI Act. As such, I think when it comes to platforms and how it's like on platforms, I think this is something that should be addressed in the DSA. So we need to be a bit careful to not mix up the regulations. But for example, deepfakes are of course something that has great potential. Deepfakes is of course already in itself a negative name because it has been used in negative names. But the technology behind that actually has a huge potential for culture industry, for example, but also maybe for personal issues. Imagine being able to with that see your late parents again or something. I think there is potential also on the positive side. So this is a good example actually. When we want to set a framework on what kind of way we want to use AI technologies.
Thank you. Thank you. Stephanie, any more views on the deepfakes? You mentioned that briefly in your remarks. I would be happy to hear some more.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So I think it's important to first of all define what we mean by deepfakes and define that better. And also a second aspect in the article would be to say what counts as manipulation, right? So the use of AI to create synthetic media is not inherently a bad thing, but as MEP Hahn also pointed out, it's rather the foundation of a modern creative digital economy. So imposing blanket obligations or requirements on the providers of AI systems that may be used to generate deepfakes could lead to an overbroad application of the rules and effectively include low-risk AI that is used every day by creatives. So from our view, the AI's Act transparency obligations should focus on the user and specify when and how to disclose content that has been generated or manipulated by AI. And any transparency obligation on the user should, of course, also ensure the protection of the right to freedom of expression and freedom of the arts. And on the other hand, we as Adobe also recognize the risk that our creative products can be used for manipulating digital media, also with the intention to deceive. And I think this intention is very, very important to take into consideration. And we founded the Content Authenticity Initiative for this already back in 2019, together with Twitter and the New York Times, to establish an open industry standard, so an open source industry standard for digital content provenance, starting with images. And we have now over 400 members in that ecosystem. And we have developed a content attribution prototype also for Photoshop, which enables the creators to share objective facts about an image, including how it was created, when, by whom, and then also how it was edited, to really empower the consumers to evaluate the authenticity of what they are seeing. And we believe this could be a good basis also for the discussion on the transparency obligations for AI systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And any additional views on this particular issue?
I think this is an issue where we're actually, in spite of everybody agreeing that we should look at the uses and not the technology, we're actually looking at whether or not you should ban the technology. And I think this poses some risks, legislative risks. One of the things that I'm slightly worried about is how on the platform side we should be able to protect against the use of deep fakes. Because if you want to have an automated marking or moderation of content using deep fakes, then you need some kind of filtering to try and identify these videos or images, at least as far as I imagine. I'd love to hear Stephanie's views on this. And I would also actually want to hear how you're suggesting to deal with the shallow fakes. There has been, at least in Denmark, and I know also in Norway, a lot of debate about the use of retouching images, and often the Photoshop is used as a sort of synonym of retouching images, where there is legislation being put forward saying we want to have indications when Photoshop or other retouching has been done. So has there been thoughts about how to implement this? Has Adobe looked into sort of image verification or markers in the electronic image in order to ease the identification of whether an image has of a person has been given smoother skin and slimmer thighs?
Yes, Stephanie, do you want to react now?
Yes, happy to. So exactly that is what Adobe has been looking at with the Content Authenticity Initiative. But we, as I said, it will be an open industry standard because we believe, this isn't something that should only be used and usable in Photoshop, but really in every editing software that we have. And that's exactly the idea behind the initiative, is not to detect what's fake, but really to give the good actors a way to authenticate their work. So, kind of to twist it around and say, well, if there are bad actors out there that have the intention of deceiving, we don't really see a way of how we can force them to use a tool like this. I mean, I guess they will never do that. But if we turn it around and you give good and reliable actors like photojournalists or journalists in general, creatives, etc., a way of showing that their work is authentic, and also by showing to the users how they edited an image or a video, for example, we believe that this could really be a game changer, because it also enables the consumers to make good decisions. It's not on the on the bad actors, but it's really rather on the good actors in combination with an informed and media literate consumer.
Thank you. Thank you for your views. We're getting some questions from the audience, so I would like to take them and actually address them to our distinguished panelists. The first question, I think, goes more to our colleagues from the European Parliament, legislators. So I would read a question. It says, the GDPR implementation was a bit messy and also expensive for SMEs in particular. Have we learned lessons from this, and how can we ensure fair and consistent implementation across the EU for this new AI Act? Would you like to take this question, Svenja or Karen? Yes, please, Svenja.
Well, first of all, if it's a regulation, so you want to ensure that is properly executed everywhere. And second, it of course needs to have a regulation with less exceptions for national member states, or less interpretation. For example, what I mentioned regarding biometric surveillance and the Commission proposal, there would still be exceptions and in accordance with national law. So right now, as the Commission proposal stands, we could see different national legislation and different set work on biometric surveillance, for example. I mean, my point in general is I don't want it at all. So it's about closing loopholes for a different national interpretation, but in general, coming as a regulation, it should be as uniform as possible setup. But I think Karen surely has something to add.
Also important with the legislation that we have, that we make sure that we allow European companies to actually be European and not have to adapt their products and their methods to each of the individual member states. So we need to make sure that there is sufficient protection of fundamental rights, for example, but that there is not a sort of protective over-implementation or over-protective regulation nationally.
Thank you for your replies. And the next question it's a sort of a version of the famous $1 million question. It comes from Facebook, and I think it would be interesting to hear views of all of you. If you had 1 million euros to invest in an AI startup, would you still invest in Europe after this AI regulation is implemented? Who wants to start? Karen, please.
Of course I would, because you have regulation that is allowing for a more trustworthy product being developed in Europe. You will be developing at the highest standards. You have a predictable regulatory environment. You're developing in democratic countries. Of course I would invest in Europe.
It's a positive answer. Next, please, Svenja, go ahead.
That clearly is our goal, that every investor says, oh, Europe is the place where I want to invest my money in future innovation. We're going to have a safe environment where I know what I'll be getting for my money, where I can rely on that there's a good framework for innovation, but also a good framework for scaling up your ideas. This is also another aspect on which we need to work on. Buzzword digital single market, there's still quite a long way to go. So yeah, that's actually my intention, that investors from all over the world say, oh, Europe is the place where we want to invest our money for future-proof technologies.
Excellent, thank you. Stephanie, how about you?
Yes, I mean, since I'm not a legislator here, I can only say it's my hope, yes, that we can, after this legislation is in place, we can still say that and answer the question with a yes. And also my hope is that obviously this would be a startup that we invest in that is very innovative, but also respects fundamental rights. And, we wouldn't want to have a startup that, can only be successful, for example, in China or Russia. So I think this is the, decisive point that the European Union can really prove that it is open for innovation and, also for the startup scene and new ideas. And doesn't block this sort of innovation.
Thank you. So it sounds like very encouraging and good news for all the future startups active in the field of AI in Europe. Stephanie, I would come back to you with the next question that comes from our audience. I think you have already alluded to it, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more in detail. What type of existing procedures do companies like Adobe have in place when it comes to AI?
Yes, sure. So as I said, we don't consider our products to be in the high risk category, but we've still taken quite a lot of measures to make sure that we develop AI in an ethical and responsible way. And for example, we have set up an AI ethics committee with more than 20 members from across Adobe that help us guide, our product development teams through the development process. And another aspect that we have is we also have an AI ethics review board that reviews new AI. So we really take this very seriously, and don't really just develop and do everything that's technically possible, but we're really very much focused on an ethical development and also using diverse groups in judging about potentially harmful outcomes. So we give this a lot of thought, and we've incorporated these procedures into our organizational structures.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us more details on that. And I have another question that is actually coming back to our initial topic on deepfakes. I think we partly touched upon that, but if you have any additional views you would like to raise, I'll be happy. So I read the question. It says, could harmonized standards help users to disclose deepfakes or other manipulated content? Who wants to take this question? I mean, I think we partly discussed it already, but is there anything additional in terms of the manipulated content in general? Karen, please.
Sorry, I think the answer by Stephanie earlier regarding the open industry standard is the sort of flip side to the question. It doesn't identify sort of deep fakes and other manipulated content, but it identifies the trustworthy and reliable edited content. And therefore, if you are sharing an image or film that is not created with this open standard, that's not controllable, then you have reason to distrust, or at least look into a little bit more the image that you're looking at. What I would also highlight, though, is that disinformation and trying to put images and films out there to disinform and manipulate, this is a sort of wider societal problem, and it's not something that we can fix with a harmonized technical solution.
I see, thanks. Any additional comments? If it's not the case, I have another question that has just appeared. So let me read it to you. And I think it comes back to the issue that we discussed earlier on the biometrics technologies. The ALDE party has passed a resolution calling for a ban on the use of automated recognition of sensitive characteristics such as gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity in the proposed regulation on a European approach on artificial intelligence. And there is a campaign calling for a ban on automated recognition of gender and sexual orientation. Is there any hope that this is included in the AI regulation proposal, and how can we help? Also, when do you think the AI regulation will be approved? So I think it goes to our colleagues from the European Parliament. Yes.
I mean, I think that it's very worrying that you have the use of artificial intelligence for trying to predict gender or race, because it is most often disproportionate use of the artificial intelligence and of the data, and that it is also heavily flawed. For example, one of the uses of this technology would be, for example, at border controls, where you would want to, where there has been use of artificial intelligence to identify the gender, and if the person in front of the border guard is non-gender conforming, they can be taken out for extra checks because they don't fit with what the artificial intelligence thinks that they should fit with. On the progress for the legislation, I'll leave that to Svenja.
So, Svenja, please.
Well, I think it's important that we have a legislative framework on this. We, of course, I think Karen already mentioned it in her opening statement, that there are technologies that can predict your sexual orientation, your gender, many aspects, and some systems like that, for example, already in use. Actually, I think in Brazil was advertising based on your gender, as it was said, it delivers more fitting ads. I actually think the consumer rights organization, they're suing against that. Need to look at how that case is going. So that, of course, you could say that has great potential, but it also has great risks. And if we say we want to use the potential of a technology, that also can mean that we exclude some potential of a technology. And I think those aspects are especially secured in our fundamental and basic laws, so that you are free of discrimination based, for example, on your sex, on your gender, sexual orientation, on your gender. So I think it is absolutely sensitive that we have a framework regulation for that.
Thank you. Thank you for your reply. I mean, as we are getting short of time, I think I will raise one or two more questions from the audience, and then we'll come back to our speakers for their closing remarks. One of the questions that has just came in actually focuses more on the high risk AI or high risk use of AI. So what are the speakers' thoughts on the feasibility of high risk AI requirements which are in the AI Act? Who wants to start on that one? How do you see the feasibility of those requirements? Svenja, yes, please.
Yeah, as I said earlier, I think we need to reshape a bit the definition of what is high risk. I think we need a bit more clarification there. I do not think it is smart to only consider whole sectors, but we really need to see at certain use cases. So there needs to be some improvement in that regard. And also, I think we should stronger focus on, when we classify something as high risk, the probability of harm causing, of like probability of harm occurring, and the severity of harm. For example, I know that some colleagues want to do everything that has to do regarding education as a high risk. I would deem to oppose that. Because yes, of course, it can have significant influence, but again, we need to look at the probability and the severity of harm. And severity of harm, the most severe thing that we can imagine is obviously the death of a human being. So in that scale, we need to have different matching or regulation that grabs at different points. So I think we need to be a bit more detailed and a bit more sensitive there. Because otherwise we risk of over-regulating, and this is something that may lead to that people will not invest €1 million in the EU.
Thank you for your clear views. Stephanie.
Yes, so maybe to add to that, so I said it in my initial statement as well, that we believe that some of the requirements could be unfeasible and ineffective. So if you, for example, look at traceability requirements, that might be an ineffective tool or method to do if you want to reach certain outcomes. Monitoring the functioning of an AI system is essential, but as I said, the traceability requirement might not be the effective tool for that. It really very much depends on the type of AI system being built. And for example, logging events for AI systems that categorize people or manipulate physical features of people and generate people, or their physical feature may not be helpful. And identifying bias for these types of features really requires, from our point of view, a human to analyze the output.
Thank you. Karen, any views on this particular issue of high-risk AI requirements?
Well, I agree with Svenja regarding need for greater nuance and precision, and I think it is good to sort of have the human in the loop, but I am a little bit worried about whether this human will actually have the competences and the time to make decisions regarding the AI, because sometimes the person is put in a position where they haven't been given the responsibility and the permission to change the decision.
Thank you. And finally, I think we're very quickly, but I think it's an aspect that we haven't mentioned in our discussion today, and is quite interesting in terms in the context of AI. There's a question about concerns in the public domain, not about the AI per se, but about the development of the artificial intelligence itself. So are there any intention at this time to set guidelines for future AI developments for sentient AI systems or the transparency in artificial decision making? Do you want to comment on this? Because it's actually, I think it's quite interesting in the field of AI, of actually some automated development of the of the technology itself.
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question regarding transparency
of artificial decision making. So the artificial intelligence decision making.
So, sorry, I didn't want to just grab the floor. I can go first, but maybe someone else wants to.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yes, of course, transparency is important. But before I actually answer that, I would like to say we do not understand a lot of things around us that work every day. I know the general way airplane works, but still I sit in one of it 2 or 3 times a week. And I do not worry about it because I trust those people that develop it, that it will work in the way that it's meant to be. So I don't think it is necessary or even possible that we understand everything literally down to the last line of code, how it's working. And I don't think that this is necessary to artificial intelligence. I understand where that wish is coming from because it kind of sounds a bit scary, but this is because we're a lot of times where we're knowingly confronted with artificial intelligence is maybe the Terminator movie or something, or the thought of AI is taking decisions and no human back. So I think it is important to create trust in the process. It will never be possible to understand fully all what is in an AI system. I think that's why it's important to have a good regulation to create the trust people need to trust those systems. That is why we need to start with having a good framework for the data that is going in that, to try our best to eradicate that biases and discrimination that are existing in our society are repeated and continued in artificial intelligence. That we have a secure framework, that it's properly tested and adjusted based on ethical standards. So this is why I think regulation is so important, to get the trust of people in those products, because we are not capable of understanding everything that is around us already now. So I think it's not realistic towards artificial intelligence, but trust is gained from a secure environment and framework, and this is where we need to work on. And of course, human oversight for trust as well.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie.
Yes, I completely agree, and it's you have to see it's quite challenging or sometimes even impossible to make algorithms more transparent, and also to explain how automatic decisions are being made. And many AI systems are constantly feeding off real-time data, so it's not always possible to predict the result of an AI application. And that's also, to repeat it, why we focus so much on the importance of testing outcomes and on the need to work with a large quality of data sets, because the more data AI is being tested and trained on, the better its real-world performance will be. And I completely agree with the aspect of MEP Hahn to say that trust is essential for this technology, and that's also why we very much welcome also the AI Act's introduction of potentially voluntary codes of conduct. So we believe that this could help further build consumer trust and also promote global best practices. But also here, given the variety of AI applications, it will be important to not have a one-size-fits-all approach to these codes of conduct.
Thank you. we are actually very close to our planned conclusion. So if you wouldn't mind, I would maybe now invite you to give us some conclusions or final remarks to wrap up this debate, which is very interesting, and it really attracted a lot of interest and a lot of questions raised also from the audience. And I'm definitely sure this is not the last time we're discussing this. So maybe I would reverse the order right now and ask our panelists to wrap up the discussions from their point of view, and start with Karen this time.
Thank you very much for an interesting discussion. It's clear from this that we need to look at artificial intelligence not just bit by bit, but as the whole system, the use of the technology, the development, and the results that it produces, in order to find regulation that ensures a artificial intelligence that is trusted by our population.
Thank you, Stephanie. Any key messages or final words on
Yes.
For today's debate, please?
Well, first of all, of course, thank you for having me, and having this panel to give me the opportunity to introduce our ideas on the AI Act. And well, just to wrap it up, I mean, we see tremendous opportunities really for AI to amplify human creativity and intelligence. And it was very encouraging to see and hear today that at least ALDE, or the Renew Europe group in the Parliament, takes a very pragmatic and innovation-friendly approach to AI. And it's really important that the AI Act contains future-proof, efficient, and feasible provisions, while also focusing on high-risk AI applications. And yeah, I look forward to staying in contact here and engaging on this topic in the future, now that the Parliament kicks off its work on it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. Svenja, please, your closing remarks.
Absolutely. I think this is great to be part of this pioneer work that has been done here, and I think it's important that we do it properly. It's important that we hear to questions, to remarks, to all kind of different stakeholders, to learn as much as we can as lawmakers, to in the end craft a carefully listen to decision and policy that allow the European Union to become the most world-leading region in artificial intelligence. Nothing less should be our ambition. So we better do a good job.
Thank you very much. Absolutely agree, and we wish you all the success in your work in the European Parliament. So I would like to thank you all to all our panelists today for the great discussions we had on this a very interesting issue. Also to everyone following us online. Thank you to ALDE Party. Thank you to Adobe for sponsoring this event, and finally, big thanks also to Ivan Delibasic from Novi for help with this event and his continuous work with ALDE Party. Thank you all. I wish you a nice day. Please stay safe, and hear and see you soon discussing AI or other relevant, interesting issue that we're discussing on the European Union level.